of Ephesians chapter 2 this morning as we go. I've asked Brother Luke Garcia to guide our minds in prayer this morning before we start. If we would pray.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this day. We thank you for the great plan for bringing us together, adopted sons and daughters of you. How your plan to have us come together with our mutual faith, our love for you, our love for one another, to make our meetings regular, to stir each other up, to give encouragement and give encouragement. We pray that we come to this class with our hearts and minds sharp and ready and receptive, and that we glean from your letter to Paul and Ephesians the comfort, the knowledge, the wisdom, the beauty, the things that you want to reveal to them. We pray that we read these scriptures and bring those to ourselves as well, so that we can perpetually grow as a body to the likeness of your Son, and that we can always be quickly ready to help our brothers and sisters and carry your message to this world. We ask this prayer in your Son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Luke. Not ideal for me, but I can't see the slides that you guys can see, so I'm going to be turning around a lot. That's why you're going to see that this morning, and that's okay. We'll be all right with that. To start us off, I wanted to tell you a quick little story. We've been privileged, my family, to be able to be part of this ongoing Sunday afternoon study at David and Christy Posey's house, and we've really enjoyed that. In that study, we've been studying the book of James. About 2 months ago, we were studying the 3rd chapter of the book of James, and you guys know the scripture that says, it's in the beginning part of the 3rd chapter that says, let not many of you be teachers because you will incur a stricter judgment, right? Everybody kind of knows that passage, and we were having a really nice discussion about what that means and what that doesn't mean, and it was a good discussion. I came away with a lot from that. And one of the things that I enjoy about that class is just being able to sit with my family during the class, and my son usually sits next to me, and he'll pipe up and make comments in the class. He's 13 years old, so some of his comments are kind of off in left field, but some of them are pretty good too, and I appreciate just kind of getting to hear where his mind's at. Well, on this particular class, he was pretty quiet. He didn't say much. In fact, he didn't say anything at all. And after the class was done, as we were walking around, I said, Eli, I missed hearing what you had to say about the class that we had. You didn't say anything. And he thought for a second. He said, well, I did have one thing that I wanted to say. And I said, well, what was that? What did you want to say? He said, well, I was thinking that you're also under strict judgment if you can teach and you choose not to. And I was like, whoa, wow, that is really deep. I hadn't thought of it that way before. And I told him, I wish you had brought that up in class, because I think that would have just spurred on a whole other part of a conversation, right, to have such a good comment. So in my pride, I quickly got out my phone and I texted David, hey, you got to hear what Eli just said to me, right? So what follows here on the screen is actual text thread between David and I on this. So this is mine, right? So I said, Eli made a good point just now. He said there's also a strict judgment if you can teach and you don't. And then I told him he should have said that in class, right? So I'm awaiting David Posey's response, which comes back just a second later, and he said, that's a good point. He's a smart kid. He does speak up in our Wednesday night class. And I was like, yeah, feeling good, right? And then this came up like 2 seconds later. By the way, would you like to teach the adult class with me and Randy this quarter? This is our eldership at work. This is your eldership at work. I like, and then this one came next right after that. But I'm serious. So this one here, this is like gentle as a dove, right? And wise as a serpent here. But it's good. It's a blessing to me, and I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to be facilitating this discussion that we have today. So we're going to be using this handout, the Rich Kid handout. Anybody needing that? And maybe Randy, if you could just get these back to people that need it. They were going for $1 on Wednesday night. They're like $1.25 today. get them now because they're just going up as the quarter moves forward. We're going to be on page 6 of this handout. Page 6. So get your handouts out. Some of these questions we've already kind of gone over a little bit, and we're going to kind of skip through some of the ones that we've already done, but we're going to pay a little bit more attention to some topics that maybe we've touched on and already kind of talked about a little bit, but need a little further development potentially. Page 6 at the bottom, the handout's confusing to me because it says Ephesians 6 at the bottom of the handout, but that doesn't mean we're on chapter 6, because it says questions on Ephesians 1 there, and just to make it a little bit more confusing, there's a number 2 above that. So that's the answer to number 3. What's the mystery that hasn't been made known to me yet, but we'll have a revelation. Maybe David will straighten that out as we move forward this quarter for us. Okay, so as we move forward, we're going to be talking about question number 2, adopted as sons, and we've talked about what that means to us. But I want, in the talking about being adopted as sons, I want to take us back a little bit and think about, we've thought about who Paul is talking to, and we've talked about the setting with which Paul was talking to with regards to the Ephesians. And we've touched on Paul's history just a little bit, but I want to revisit that a little bit because I think it sheds some light on the principles that he's trying to impart to these people. So we're going to go back about 25 years to this passage here, and this is Paul recounting his conversion experience to King Agrippa. This is the words of Paul, actually, to just kind of get our minds ready. And as we read this, I want you guys to think about being adopted and how that plays into it. Can I have a volunteer just to read over my shoulder, someone that can see that real well? Because I don't want to turn around backwards and do it. Brian, great. You're in the front row, so you don't even have to see 2020, right, to see that. You can do it. For it.
I said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Arise and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a minister and a witness, both of the things which you have seen and of the things which I will yet reveal to you. I will deliver you from the Jewish people as well as from the Gentiles, to whom I now send you, to open their eyes, in order to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me."
Good. So, we don't have to question what Paul's purpose is when he wrote to the Ephesians because it's listed right here for us. His purpose was given to him during his conversion by Jesus, the Christ. And I think it's really interesting as we move forward in our discussion on chapter 1, the remainder of our discussion on chapter 1, to be thinking about how Paul is actively trying to fulfill the purpose that Jesus gave him in the book of Ephesians that he writes. So we're not unaware of what Paul's purpose is. And part of that, as Brian read for us, is to just inform the Gentiles that they do have an inheritance. So this word, or this phrase, adopted as sons, this is from chapter 1, verse 5. Does somebody want to read that out? You don't have to raise your hand, just shout it out. Chapter 1, verse 5.
He predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will.
That's right. Thank you, Grant, for doing that. Again, the purpose of chapter 1 we talked about is Paul telling us who we are, right? Getting us to realize who we are. And we are adopted. So question number 2, what's the meaning of adopted sons? We did talk about adoption, right, and how beautiful that concept is, and that it doesn't just happen, that it's something that a parent kind of has to have a goal for. They have to work towards it. They have to have a plan. Maybe even like you could consider that a predestined plan, right, for this to occur, for them to adopt a kid. I always think, I've talked to enough of you guys that have adopted kids to hear this story kind of play out differently, where the adopted son or daughter gets to the age where they fully realize that they're adopted, or maybe they're challenged by a birth sibling or something like that, and they have this discussion with their adoptive parents, and something is said that's like, well, I had these other kids, but I chose you, right? And how beautiful that is, that relationship is, and different that relationship is with the adoption. God chose us, and I think that means something really special. So let's think about it in terms of what it meant to the original audience. So who's the original audience? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they come from different backgrounds, right? So the backgrounds they come from are Jewish, right, and also Gentile. So anybody have any comment on that, like what that must have felt like, maybe coming from one of those groups? Yeah, Roy. I think you're right about that, Ed.
Yeah, it's interesting that when Paul uses this, because he was Jewish, and because so many, you would imagine, felt that natural kinship, and in the Roman letter he says they were the natural branches that cut off because of unbelief, and who were Gentiles were then grafted in. But in Romans, when he talks about this, he says something interesting in chapter 9, verse 4. When he talks about Israelites, he says, to whom belongs the adoption as sons. And what he's talking about here goes back to the prophets, where God said, okay, I'm disowning you in Hosea 10, divorcing them, and I'm going to once again, betroth you to myself. I'm going to court you once again and bring you back and marry you again. Of course, Christ is the bride and the church is the bridegroom. We understand that connects to Hosea. But this other aspect of it about the fact that they were then as much in need of adoption as Gentiles were, Paul makes a point of saying that's one of the things Israelites can brag about in Romans 8:14. And so that, the way that this would be looked at, both Jews and Romans had procedures that were complicated, involved planning to adopt, but the Romans more than the Jews. The Romans really had the law on that. But the Jews had this prophecies that connected this to their unfaithfulness.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that only in Christ could even Jews be saved. And so Paul, as I mentioned, it's really striking to me that Paul, is so celebrating the fact that he's adopted in. And so that it really strikes me that all of us should just be humble enough to realize none of us were by nature, as it were. We all started out okay, and then we chose a different path.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we're going to get into how that affects us, but I think that tie-in of the Jewish adoption, I think is good. I was thinking more along the lines of Roy in terms of just the Gentiles and how that must have felt to be included. Yes. Right back in the back. I saw a hand that came out of the pew. There we go. that adoption kind of ties all of that together in the inheritance idea as well. Simply from a Gentile standpoint, they had always been from the outside looking in, right? There was no formal recognition of any kind of a covenant or relationship with this one Jehovah God, no circumcision or anything like that they could participate in. There's going to be some language in chapter 2 where we see that, he says, you were once far and now you're near. These are beautiful, beautiful things. So again, to tie us back to what Paul's purpose was initially, he's working to fulfill his Jesus-given purpose, right, of helping the Gentiles understand their inclusiveness. And the Holy Spirit, of course, is guiding him in this work and guiding him to use these terms like adoption and inheritance and things like that to help get that point across. What does that mean to us? Does anybody have any comments? I really liked Randy's presentation on Wednesday when he got to that part about forgiveness where he was like, what does it mean to you guys? That was delightful. We had probably 5 or 6 pretty lengthy comments about what that meant to us. Does anybody kind of connect with this? Ed kind of started. Yes, Ben.
Well, I don't want to jump into the next question, but it kind of gets into the point of what we're getting to overall with the unity that we're all in. And I think that's what means to us today. I mean, the part we haven't talked about is for all these Gentiles and Jews that all set aside to become Christ believers. I mean, your whole life was wrapped up in your family, your job, what you have, where you live.
Your identity.
It wasn't like going to college and applying for jobs and living in another town. You were kind of tied up. If you believe in Christ, you were kind of already separated. You didn't have great support group. And he's saying you have it in Christ. You are all unified. You have that in Christ. And I think the same thing with Christ today. We've always had to write that line with families and church. And the church in Christ is always the one. So all you got to tell myself, that's always first. And all else is on the unification of the church in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're all about it. We put all that other stuff behind us.
Yeah. I think what I thought of in terms of being adopted was that, we are not by our own nature and by our own laurels, by the things that we do, we are not birth children of God. Like, we can't claim that. But we can still be entitled, like Christy said on Wednesday. We are entitled to this inheritance that we have, and we still have that entitlement. But we don't have it because of our own nature. We have it because, not because of our own birthright, but because of our adoption that happens through the blood of Jesus Christ. So we can have that security and that entitlement and that pride that comes with having that inheritance as adopted sons, because all of that is coming through Jesus Christ. So all of our pride is in Jesus, not in ourselves, but in Jesus as being a redeemer to take someone like me and give me that inheritance. So yeah, I say we pour on all the entitlement and all the pride and all the security that's involved in that, but we funnel that through Jesus Christ as our Savior, not from something that we did or something that we earned. Okay, so let's get into, we're going to combine questions 4, 5, and 6 together when we're talking about Paul's prayer. Can I get a volunteer to read chapter 1, verses 15 through 19? Can someone read that for me? You can. Yes, thank you, Zach. Go ahead.
For this reason, because I have heard of your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love for all the saints, I do not cease to give thanks for you, remembering you in my prayers, that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you the spirit of wisdom and of revelation in the knowledge of Him, having the eyes of your heart enlightened, that you may know what is the hope to which He has called you, what are the riches of His glorious inheritance in the saints, and what is the immeasurable greatness of His power toward us who believe, according to the working of His great might.
Great. So when we read that, this is Paul vocalizing the prayer that he's been praying for the Ephesians. So can we think about, before we launch into what he prays for, can Anybody want to comment on the characteristic or any attributes of this prayer, just generally speaking? Ed, do you have one of those?
Well, I just wanted to notice that contextually, the prayer doesn't really end for a long time. And so that theoretically, I usually end it at 2:10 because he's talking about three things, the third of which is power that has two demonstrations, the resurrection of Jesus and our resurrection, and so forth. But you can even say that he then does this digression in 2:11, but it's still connected to what he's praying for. Obviously, it's not a prayer. He's reciting what he normally prays for to them. But the point of this really has to do with their spiritual enlightenment, is the way I would kind of summarize that. And that there are a lot of ways to do that, to summarize it. And then it's interesting that when he does say what this enlightenment involves, wisdom and revelation, is going to help us to understand those three things. They're defined very differently than the world does. And so the kind of expectations or hopes that we have, the kinds of riches that we value or abundance that we value, and the kind of power that we value, these are spiritually oriented in the Ephesian letter. And whether you're Jew or Gentile, it kind of is jarring. As was mentioned earlier, the old man, you were trained with these kind of predatory ideas of what expectations should be in life, and what what power is supposed to look like, because he's going to spend a whole lot of time talking about what power looks like, that we need to have our eyes of our heart enlightened for. All of that then has to do with how to be wise. So that this prayer for them then leads into the whole rest of the book. And it's kind of a prayer for us, that we can grow up and have a different view of wisdom than the world does. And it strikes me that's what's going on in this movement here, in this discussion about his prayer.
Sure. So arguably it does extend into the second chapter, but looking specifically at 15 through 19, because I'm not allowed to go into chapter 2, right? So looking at 15 through 19, again, looking for characteristics, and maybe I'll just kind of spill what I'm thinking here. When I look at it, I think it's very thankful, right? So I read a statistic that said Paul uses that derivative of thanks, like thankfulness or thank you or thanking, thanks be. He uses that 49 times in the New Testament. He's a very thankful person. I think that's something that I could learn when I'm praying, right, is to be more vocally thankful and thinking about how I can encourage and uplift and edify other people in the church, being vocal about how I'm, the thankfulness that I have. I'm good at saying thanks to God for these things that happen in my life, and then just kind of blanket statement saying being thankful for my family, for my kids, for my parents, for those types of things, but not necessarily really good at reaching out to you guys and saying specific things in my prayers about how I'm thankful for specific members and what they do and how they come out of my life. I think that's something we can learn from Paul. The other thing I was thinking too was how specific his recollection or his communication with the saints at Ephesus is about what he's praying for. And I think it's really helpful, don't get me wrong, to say to someone who maybe is going through a hardship in their life, to say that blanket statement. What do we say when someone's having a hardship? We say, I'm praying for you, right? You're in my prayers, or you're in my thoughts and prayers. But maybe taking that a step further, kind of like Paul does, and saying something more specific to that person about, I'm praying for you that during this hard time you will turn your hearts and your minds to God, who will get you through it. And it's not going to be easy, and you might not ever get through it. You're going to have a new normal or whatever, but this is what I'm praying for you for. And how much more meaningful maybe and impactful that comment might be, rather than just this thing that I hear all the time, even from people that I would consider are kind of non-believers, will say something like, you're in my thoughts and my prayers. Be more specific, and just more specific I think would be good. Anybody want to add anything to that before we move on? Ben, yes.
Kind of along with that, we would say, please pray for me while I'm in prison. While I'm in prison, please pray for me, then I'll get to you. But he doesn't even mention that. He's just totally being very specific about their needs throughout this whole time.
Oh, you were saying if we were Paul, we would be saying that? Oh, okay. thought, what's going on with Ben? Does anyone know what's going on with Ben? Is there like an announcement that's going to be made today? Pray for Ben. He's going to prison. No, that's good. Yes, right. The difference of how he would have stated that. So let's talk a little bit about specifically what Paul does pray for. And before we do that, let's go back to this slide here. By the way, Rachel, my daughter, who is computer savvy, helped me format all my slides. So give her some props when you see her, because I don't know what I'm doing on this, and she really helped me out. She's so cute. She had all these, she wanted to take this slide and flip it around. And I was like, hey, you're going to make an old person fall out of the pew if you do that. I think let's just keep it standard, popping up. But she had all kinds of different things. So, anyways, we're going to go back. Christy had a comment that she wanted to make. Right. Right there, right? So that's what he's, again, going back to what Paul's commission was. And here is Paul writing this book 25 years later, trying to do what Jesus told him to do when he was converted. And I think, one thing that I think of too, which this might just be speculation, but I think it's worth bringing out. Remember Paul's conversion. He was blind for a few days, right? He was blind. And then the account in Acts says something like scales fell off his eyes. I'm not sure really what all that is. And then he saw immediately. And what did he do? He arose and he got baptized, right? So there was a big kind of eyes opened, conversion happened, right, with Paul. And I wonder sometimes when we read this, if we're reading the correct emphasis in that the eyes of your heart would be enlightened. Maybe what Paul is saying is, I'm praying that the eyes of your heart will be enlightened, like the eyes of my heart were enlightened. Right? I pray that this same experience happens for you that happened for me, Angie.
I was thinking about that too. People sometimes say, "You heard me, but you're not hearing me." And I think he's praying. He's already said, "I told you these things. You know this stuff. I want you to get it. I want you to understand it. And the only way you will understand a thing or get a thing is if you want to."
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes with our kids, we're like, "You're just being so obtuse. Just get it, you know."
Yeah.
And you know they know the words you're saying, or actually what I see from them often is, "Am I speaking a different language?" Like, you know what I'm saying, but they don't want to. And so I think Paul wants them to want to get it.
Yeah, I think that it gets to the crux of what that phrase is about having the eyes of their heart enlightened. Look at this next thing that I kind of brought up, that you may know the riches of his inheritance. Hang on just a second. This is something that I kind of glossed over and didn't get until teaching this class or whatever. I think it's important to kind of understand kind of what he's talking about here. So what I had always thought of was he's talking about, he wants them to understand how great their inheritance is, right? How great heaven is, how great it is to be a Christian or whatever. And he is talking about that back in verse 11. He refers to an inheritance that belongs to the saints, right? And how great that is going to be that they get to participate in that. But in this part of the prayer, he says, you may know the riches of his inheritance. This is not the saints' inheritance. This is an inheritance belonging to God. Was I the only one that didn't pick up on that? I don't know. Maybe that's maybe that was just me. But it's circular. So we in the church, we have an inheritance, right? As heaven, as adopted sons. And then, in turn, God inherits us. And the other thing that I think is really neat is that inheritance that God has in us is pleasurable to him, like verse 5 says, according to the pleasure of his good will, right? The good pleasure of his will. So this hope of his calling that Paul talks about, these inheritances are mutually inclusive, right? They occur together. And Paul wants them to understand the richness that they have in being part of this group that God inherits, right? So the richness of being part of a church that gets to be inherited by God, and how wonderful it is that when you get God, God in turn gets you, right? And that whole kind of how he bundles that all together there. Ed is just burning with something to say. Sorry, I see your hand.
There's a big, there are two different ways that people have looked at Ephesians ever since the second century. Okay, one is that there's a whole school of thought that every time he says we, he's talking about Jewish Christians like himself. And if you actually run that through, it makes perfect sense. And then when he says you, he's always talking about Gentiles. And it answers kind of a question in the futures. And people like Carly Caldwell and talk about the Jeff Meltzer and others go that direction more. If you don't know who they are, don't worry about it. But the point is that even in our writings today, people who are members of the church are reflecting on this reality that may be there. Now, sometimes the other way of looking at it is that when he says we, you, and specifies Gentiles, then he's talking about Gentiles. But if he just says he's talking about the recipients of the letter. Part of the problem is he knows lots of people in Ephesus that were usually Jewish, and he converted early in the going, and that much of this letter is not written to, appears to be written more to the Gentiles, whom he did not seem to have as much work involvement with in the book of Acts and in other access that we have. And so I said all that to say, one way of looking at this is that the Gentile Christians themselves then would now realize something Jewish people and Jewish Christians had understood. They knew that Israel was God's inheritance. That was always part of it. But the idea of being a non-Jew, being part of God's inheritance, being grafted into that same root, wow, that's mind-boggling. And in the Romans 8 passage, he goes on to say, for sons, then we have this co-inheritance with Messiah. Wow, I'm a Gentile. I don't deserve that. I'm not connected to any of that. But of course, even the Jews were disowned and had to have this grace in Christ to be able to have that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that part of this is that this is rich. This is what riches looks like. It doesn't look like going to Hawaii or to France or something like that. The riches that God enjoys by his good pleasure is us at being his people, extending his son's body into every aspect of our life.
Yeah.
That's what wealth looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And like Ben was talking about, reorienting our view of what family looks like. Here, reorienting what the inheritance looks like is big.
Yeah, I think that's dead on. So we're going to switch to a different, the church is God's possession, God inherits us. So we're going to switch to a different question here. This question is number 9 on page 7, the status of Christ. We're going to be talking about what Paul views and what the true status of Christ is. But before we get there, we're going to talk a little bit about what the world thinks where Christ's status should be. So anybody want to throw out a comment about where they think Jesus stands in the world today? That's pretty broad. I can get it started. Ben can get it started.
An add-on, Christ is just an add-on.
Yeah. That's good. Like the co-pilot, right? Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, for some people who don't want to deal with what he represents, he's a historical figure.
Okay. And nothing more. Uh-huh. It was close to a hand, but it was more like that. It's almost a hand up. Aaron. Yeah. Right. We're going to contrast that here in just a second too, but this is what I thought of. Some people will say he's just a good and wise man, right? No deity necessarily involved in that at all. A respected teacher might be something else. And then some people will take that a little step further, right, and say we should probably emulate him or do what he says. And then, that makes me think, and then they say, if we can do what he says, then we can earn heaven, right? We do what he says, be a good person, good people go to heaven kind of thing. I think also of what would Jesus do kind of thing, when kind of losing sight of the fact that it's kind of what would Jesus did. Like what did he did? He did it. He did it already. He already did it, right? Also, there's this, right? Some people I don't think any further than this. They use it as a curse word, as a swear word, right? And that's Jesus Christ in their daily life, living that out. I have to give this sentiment credit to Amy Maurer. She says one time to Danny and I, you just have to look at those people who use the swear words and just say, oh, isn't that so sad that they don't possess the vocabulary skills to be able to communicate the way that they feel. They default back to that one word every time. Isn't that sad? I thought that's a good way to look at those exclamatory words. There is no regard. There's no thought at all. And there might be effort to keep it that way, right? We've had people that shut us down, right, when we try to talk about that. That might be their status of Jesus in their life. And then there's this one. This is like the seasonal Jesus that comes out Christmas and comes out on Easter. Danny said it's like an allergy, comes out in the springtime. You deal with it, and then it goes away for a little while. And then what about this one? This is the Jesus that comes out like for the funeral service, right? And that's it. Put a little Jesus on that, owie, and then it goes away. David.
On the third one, I read a statement a few months ago about how people use these Jesus, though, I don't think anybody else knows what it is. Here he kind of became sweet child, and put it in brings up stuff. Only Jesus dealt with it. And so that was an argument for them, I think, about how important it is.
Mm-hmm. How much of an impact he has made. Yeah. So I know there's lots of comments kind of going, but I want to move through these slides that Rachel made for us. So what's the true status of Christ today from chapter 1:20 and onward? He's in a position of power. When you think about people that have been put in a position of power, like I think about presidents or kings or something like that, or dictators, right? They put themselves into power, or they were voted into power by their inferiors, right? But that's not the case with Jesus. He was put in power by the one that had omnipotent power. God had power over death, right? Raising Jesus up, and that's who gave Jesus his position at the right hand of God. It's pretty special. He is above all, regardless of location, heaven and earth. He's above all in terms of time, right? The present and the future. He's eternal. And Jesus has been made head over all of the things, right? All of the things to the church. So, I love verse 22 and the singularity of verse 22 when you look at the pronouns. He, singular, put all things under his feet and gave him, singular, to be head over all things to the singular church. One God gave one Jesus to be the head over one church, and he's our all in all, right? So we had an invitation song we'd sing all in all right now. Okay, so then we have some popular commentators call Ephesians a spiritual power bar. Do you agree, and why? That's the question that we have, right? So I'm going to tell you, if you see a question that's phrased like this and it doesn't say, do you agree, why or why not, you kind of know the answer is yes, right? So does anybody want to comment on why they think Ephesians might be their spiritual power bar? Ed?
I want to just notice that power and authority are different. Power has to do with capacity or control, depending on how one uses it. Authority has to do with the good right to rule. It's a power that we are to be aware of. The power put Jesus in authority over all rule and authority, power, and name, might, and guess what?
Mm-hmm. Randy.
I look at it a little different. I don't disagree with any of it. I just kind of get a little more personal when I look at it. Thinking how the Ephesians were probably expected to lead this as he wrote it. He's reminding them that they have spiritual power. I have spiritual power. And he just lists all these things that he prays for. I actually listed 9 of them down, specific things.
Mm-hmm.
As reminders that God has adopted me into his family. I am entitled to the inheritance that he and only he can give me. And that I have the Holy Spirit working in me to help me understand his word. And I have the strength through Christ to deal with anything that's thrown at me. Because he's in control. He's got power. And he let me know that if I stay in him, I'm safe.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives me spiritual power. And I hope that the Ephesians made of that. A big part of it, at least Paul's intent was to get them to see and remind them of all that he told me 3 years he was with them. You are special people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
God chose you, and I've given you all the strength you need to deal with whatever's going on in the world.
It's empowering. Yeah, Angie.
I'm thinking of this. Yes, of course, I agree with you as well as we should. But when I think of a power bar, it's this little thing that is dense and rich and nutritious and helpful, and it gives you this burst of energy. And so the analogy taken to power bar is Ephesians is a pretty short, dense, rich book that gives us this intense peace and energy. It's not a big fat meal like Romans is,
Mm-hmm. Love it. Okay. And it's there when we need it. That's right. And chapter 2 is going to be awesome. I can't wait to talk about it. So we're going to launch into that next time. Thank you for your attention and for your comments. Really appreciate it.